Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, a program dedicated to exploring the contributions of archaeology in the Middle East to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark, director of the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University. I'm joined by three colleagues from La Sierra University, Dr. Larry Geraty, who is co-host of this program, former president, archaeologist, Old Testament specialist, but you've led tours to a number of New Testament sites, like Ephesus that we'll be talking about this time. Dr. Warren Trenchard, who is a professor of New Testament and of early Christianity, and is in charge of graduate students, getting them through their programs in the Divinity School, HMS Richards Divinity School. Dr. Kent Bramlett is Associate Professor of Archaeology and the History of Antiquity at La Sierra. We all share a strong interest in archaeology. Warren, you've been part of our project several seasons, and we all share a commitment to Scripture, Old Testament, except for Warren. And Warren brings with him this expertise, now that we're walking through the New Testament books, that is indispensable. Thank you, Warren, for coming and being part of this. Book of Ephesians, that generate positive responses? Is this a book that you would turn to for a particular church or personal or devotional sort of need? What would you do with Ephesians?
It is a very popular devotional piece because of the beauty of its expression sometimes. It's a very comforting book in places. Yeah, good book to go to for devotionals.
Calls us to, I think of unity as one of the primary concerns of Ephesians.
There's some marvelous extended prayers in the book. And one of the interesting things for a reader of it in its original setting is that it has some huge sentences. Chapter 1, except for the first couple of verses, which are kind of introductory for the letter, goes on to have 2 sentences that make up the rest of the chapter. And chapter 2 has 2 sentences as well. So it's not the way we tend to teach people how to write, but the ideas are complicated and they're intertwined, and so the writer just got going and couldn't stop.
Kent, what do you think about this book?
Well, I think the way Paul addresses unity is interesting. First of all, Ephesians is written to the people in Ephesus, not far from Miletus, where Greek philosophy began, and Ephesus was known as an area where different ideas were discussed. So he talks about building unity, but of all the different parts. So he's not trying to homogenize, but he's trying to bring people together nonetheless.
I've heard it said that it may have been written not just for the church at Ephesus, but for the churches in that region. What would you say to that suggestion?
Well, Larry, it's possible, in fact, that it was not just to the churches in the region, but potentially to all of Paul's churches and the whole of early Christianity in the middle part of the 1st century and toward the latter part of the 1st century. One of the interesting little things, and we'll see a slide with one of the early manuscripts of this letter. Paul's letters tend to have a structure and a form that is common to all letters written in that period, whether they're formal or informal, that start out with the name of the writer and indicate the identity of those who are receiving the letter. There is some kind of little greeting, and this is followed by a prayer or a statement of thanksgiving before getting into the body of the letter. And then at the end, typically a set of greetings. This letter differs from that in a few important ways. Paul is identified as the writer to begin with, but it does not identify specifically who the readers are.
In the early manuscripts?
In the earliest manuscripts. Right. And I was just looking in my Revised Standard Version of the Bible, which was translated in the middle of the last century, and it translates it in exactly that kind of way. It starts out by saying, Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus, by the will of God, to the saints who are also faithful in Christ Jesus. And that's basically how these earliest manuscripts read, suggesting maybe that in its original form, this was not written specifically to that congregation in Ephesus, but in fact to a much larger group. There are other clues that we may be able to talk about later as we talk about this.
Well, and we're thinking Ephesus And that is probably fine, especially if it's to several groups.
Sure.
But we're thinking Ephesus, especially as we're thinking about these artifacts in front of us, and as we look at the slides, we'll focus on Ephesus. And if it fits a wider audience, that's okay. It would fit Ephesus.
And
too.
Ephesus is not to be unexpected in terms of Paul and his career. He spent, as far as that whole his whole time in that region of the Aegean, east and west of it, probably more time in Ephesus combined than any of the others. So it was especially, I think, associated with the ministry of Paul, and so that name would be associated with this letter is not to be unexpected.
You know, as I was looking at these artifacts that's on the table in front of us, I was thinking if Paul walked in on us, he would not be surprised at anything that he saw there. He'd feel right at home, wouldn't he, with everything that he sees?
Well, we have a few weapons over here on the right side that we'll get
That
to.
would be a
that
little
would come a
bit-
little early.
yeah.
But wouldn't be that much different, I don't suspect, from Roman spears, swords, daggers, and so on. Kent, what do we have on your end of the table?
Well, we have some inscription fragments. Of course, this is a period when communication is probably the easiest at any time up to that point. So the Roman Empire, communication could progress from one end of the empire to the other. And we have documents, of course, those wouldn't be the kind you carry around and from one point to another, but these are nonetheless sources of information for us.
And this is where the people
inscriptions.
come to the information rather than sending the information to the people, right?
It is.
You'd sort of put up a slab and have the inscription in it, and people walk by and stop and read it and find out what the authorities want you to know.
Exactly, and there are ways to honor the
Right.
individuals who perhaps built a structure, a building. And so it's a very important component of society at this time.
Now, you also have a model there.
Yeah, this is a model of a small statue of Artemis. We know in the story in Acts where there's a revolt in Ephesus because the artisans who are making these small keepsakes, probably models of Artemis for the temple there, the temple of Artemis, riot against Paul's preaching because they feel he's cutting into their business. People are no longer coming to buy the artifacts they're making.
Now, the Greek or the Roman form of that would be Diana. Is that right?
Yes.
So it'd be moved from Artemis to Diana, same deity.
They made these cross connections between most of the deities, not only between Greek and Roman, but also with the Phoenician further east deities.
Okay, we have a few other things, including some more writing materials.
Exactly. So we have a glass inkwell. It's a very heavy little vessel with a very small area inside, but that would be the ink well where you put the ink. It's not liable to tip over because it has very thick, heavy glass at the base. And then you'd have a little stylus or a quill. And we have an example of real papyrus with a fragment of an Egyptian inscription, document. And these are preserved, of course, only where it's very dry, the deserts of Egypt. But this kind of communication also was widely used. We just don't have them preserved in most places.
Tell us why they used papyrus as a writing.
Well, the Egyptians had developed the technology going way back and had exported it, whether intentionally or not, I don't know. But Byblos, of course, was one of the major foreign trade depots, really, of the Egyptians. Hence, a lot of papyrus came through, and that's where we get our name Bible. It comes from biblion. And it's very functional. You can write on it. It's light. You can roll it up. It's flexible. And
Inexpensive.
Inexpensive. Sure, it's made of reeds from the Nile. So short of having the technology to break down tree fiber and make real paper as we know it, that was very effective.
Okay, Larry, ceramics. You are surrounded by ceramics here.
Right. On the front, we have our lamps, the earliest being over here. We know from the nozzle where the flame was with the wick that it has been used, and the oil would be put here. And this has a decoration around the hole where the oil went. Sometimes you would have inscriptions there. During Christian times, there's the popular one is that the light of Christ shines beautifully for all. The next one is a Roman figure of some kind, Sometimes they had naughty scenes
Naughty
on
scenes,
their
okay.
lamps, right? But so this is a variety of lamps, and this one is particularly interesting because it has what is often called the chi rho, what we would call looks like an X, and an R we would call it today, which are symbols of Christ. And this one could have been made in a mold similar to this mold that's here.
Very close.
So they would have the bottom half and the top half made separately, and then they would be connected. And these other ceramic vessels are very typical of the period, bowls and jugs and cooking
Right.
pots and so forth, all illustrating daily life in the time of Paul.
And we want to thank Audrey Schaefer for the mold
Right.
and the lamp, the Geraty mold and lamp, and Christina Reed for pulling all of these things together from our collections, as she always does.
Right.
And then we have on the rest of the table metal objects. They're all metal, and they are all related in some way to military behavior. We're talking about protection with a helmet. We have spear points, daggers, battle axes, arrow points, lance, so a whole range of things to illustrate the language of Ephesians 6, where one is to put on the whole armor of God. And several of those things are mentioned, and so we have them here. And it's a great way to think about archaeological connections with the biblical text, very direct connections with the biblical text. So then let's take a look at some slides and think about the book itself. And we're going to be turning to Warren to help us with
Right.
a number of the background issues. We will turn, as we always do, as we begin a book, to chronological and geopolitical context. And so first of all, the Roman Empire. Kent, spot Ephesus for us.
Well, the yellow box helps
The yellow
quite a lot,
box
doesn't it?
helped. And this is the second of Paul's missionary journeys, and it seems to show up in the third of the journeys
And I've
too.
always heard about 2.5 years if you combine the time would.
Right.
It's close to the amount.
So a
of
long time in Ephesus. That does matter, doesn't it? And then another image here of basically of all of what would be Asia Minor, or
Turkey,
what is now
we'd call it
Turkey.
today.
That's correct. And so we see where Ephesus is. And here it's surrounded by a lot of New Testament sites. Think about the 7 cities of Revelation, the Apocalypse, and then a number of places where Paul ministered. So this is actually a good map to illustrate certainly Christian ministry and missionary work in the early years. Kent, walk us through this this footprint of Ephesus.
Well, if you come up the Harbor Road, and the water was there at that time, it's now been silted in and is quite far out. You would come first to the theater. This is one of the largest theaters in the Eastern Roman Empire. It would seat about 25,000 people, so very considerable.
Right.
And you could turn then and make your way to the Agora. And of course, the Agora is the marketplace, the main hub for commerce. There would be merchants there. And then you proceed up through a number of monumental buildings, past the Library of Celsus, Heracles Gate, some very fine houses in this area, very aristocratic. And then you would proceed up to some secondary areas, another Agora, baths, an Odeon, which is a small theater. And then way up above, which hasn't really been excavated yet, are vast areas of residential districts.
Now, it's my understanding that the Celsus Library actually was completed in 80, so probably wasn't there. Is that correct?
Well, it was, I think, more like the end of Trajan's
Okay.
rule, so maybe 118. or
Also
something
even
like
further down.
that. Right.
So it wouldn't have been there when Paul was there.
It would not have.
But it's so iconic, as we'll see in a minute in a picture. Excellent. And of course, our chronological context. Claudius and Nero, the 2 Roman emperors whose reigns cover this time period that we're talking about with Paul's missionary work. We have developed, with your help, Warren, a kind of a general chart here chronologically of the letters. And without taking a lot of time, we're putting Ephesians in this time period, AD 60 to 62. Why is that? And why this cluster? And where do they come from? Or where do they originate, it appears?
Well, the traditional understanding of this collection of Paul's letters arises from language in most of them that refer to his imprisonment. And so, understandably, these are called the prison letters, along with Philemon, which is a personal letter that also assumes Paul's being in prison. The questions, however, that arise from that kind of designation have to do with where was the prison and at what time period in his life did he write these. There are three time periods and locations that tend to emerge. The traditional understanding is that he was in Rome, probably during his first of a couple of imprisonments there, although there are some that feel it was the later of the two. And the other one, which does have a documented imprisonment, would be from much earlier, which would be in Caesarea on the coast of the Mediterranean in Palestine.
Which is the capital of the Roman region of Palestine, wasn't it?
Right, well, particularly back in the days of Jesus, it was the capital of Judea, where Pontius Pilate, the emissary of the emperor, resided. But Paul was in prison there at one point, and there are some who feel that the provenance of these letters may have been that imprisonment, which would make it considerably earlier. This dating, however, as I mentioned, assumes that this is a Roman imprisonment. Now, of course, I suppose one could look at this and say, was Paul ever imprisoned and did he ever write anything? Most scholars feel that he was imprisoned at some point, and they're kind of divided as to whether it's the earlier or the later of these two dates.
You do have Philippi, he's imprisoned. You have at least some suggestions about where the prisons might be. So, but I don't know how that fits into the chronology as you're describing.
Philippi would probably be too early. That is right at the very beginning of his second mission trip, near the beginning, when they move into Europe for the first time.
And it wouldn't make a lot of sense to be writing from prison to your community just outside the prison doors. So we have
Paul's situation seems to be quite dire by the time he writes these letters, and so one would presume probably Rome or the serious situation in Caesarea.
Right.
I think probably the Roman provenance makes the most sense.
Okay, so briefly, we have data that the scholars always think about when we turn to a new book, and here with Ephesians. We've talked about date of writing. How do we think about author audience?
I think this word author here gives us an opportunity to talk about a phenomenon in biblical writing, ancient writing in general, that differs from the way we tend to think about things. We see the name of somebody on a book as the author, or a group of people as the writers of a book. We can be pretty sure that those people actually wrote it. There are some exceptions to that, of course, but if you look in the classification of books in a library, you can look under author, you have some confidence that the people listed there are the ones who wrote the books and materials. In the ancient world, things were not quite as simple as that. Authorship, of course, could mean that, and often did mean that this was a reference to the person who actually wrote it out. Paul makes reference to this a couple of times in his letter to Philemon and in the letter to the Colossians. He makes some reference to the fact, I am writing this with my own hand. Right. Now, he may be just writing that particular portion of the text, but he is claiming authorship of that specific place. In other cases, Paul tends, as he does in Romans, to include a greeting from somebody who says, I'm the one who wrote this book. I'm the one who wrote this letter. This is probably an example of Paul providing a kind of dictation to someone who would write it down. As prominent as papyrus was, it was not the easiest thing on which to write. And particularly if you tried to write against the grain on the back side. And so they tended to use professionals to write on these things. And so it's clear that Paul and others used people to actually write things out for them.
Just as they did in the Old Testament. Jeremiah had a secretary, Baruch, right, who helped him write. He probably dictated, and Baruch wrote. So,
right.
Yeah.
And then in some cases, writers of materials, those who wanted to produce things, would give someone who was skilled in writing, not only the physical enterprise of writing, but could put ideas together well. It would give them a list of ideas, and that person would write it out for them. Right. This seems to be what lies behind the letter in the New Testament we call 1 Peter, where he identifies a person named Silvanus at the end of the book, who says, "Through Silvanus I have written to you, and I have confidence in what he's done." Yeah. So we have some of these examples. In some cases, writers, the name of a person would be associated with a writing if the congregation or the group in which where it emerged wanted to dedicate it to that person. They may have had a history with them, like one of the apostles who came and founded a church in a particular region. In some cases, it was a student or an admirer of somebody a few years later, after the person had passed away, who decided to write down a set of ideas that were commensurate with, that sounded like, that he or she had learned from that particular person and wrote them out in that person's name.
Such as the gospel writers, for instance.
The gospel writers may have had that situation. One of the gospels seems to have developed in a community, in fact, all of them in a community, but one in particular, where this person who's named there probably came, founded the church, lived there for some period of time, and so forth. We have, among the New Testament writers, examples of all of these kinds of things.
Right.
And the letter to the Ephesians, as it's called in the New Testament, is probably one of these. It seems to have been written after the time of Paul by one of his admirers, associates, who was wanting to honor Paul with a collection of Pauline ideas taken from Romans, 1 Corinthians, other letters that we know Paul wrote, and published this, no doubt, at the head of a whole collection of Pauline materials. And one reason Ephesus is likely associated with this, and in the later manuscripts the name comes into the text as the recipients, is probably that this collection of Pauline materials was first published in and released in Ephesus, as one might expect.
Good perspectives. Oh, we had an outline that went past us very quickly there. And we won't spend a lot of time on this. We do have a couple of things that stand out, like down at number 7, the armor of God that we've talked about here.
Illustrated by what we have on the table here.
Exactly, and the ministry of Paul and so on. So a number of parts to this outline. But we will scoot to some issues that show up. What strikes me is that the issues like inheritance, adoption, even mystery, circumcision, these keep showing up over and over in Paul's letters. So these evidently were problems or issues that showed up in maybe maybe all of these Mediterranean churches.
Well, I think even more, Doug, what is showing up here with all of the things that you mentioned are references to everyday life that people were encountering. Many of these terms are used metaphorically by Paul. We think of them as kind of lofty stained glass window words, but they were everyday words in the courts, in the agora, in the marketplace, in people's homes, in their lives generally, medical terminology and everything else, right out of the everyday lives that people were living.
And we have to find out about those by archaeology, don't you think?
I think so.
I think we're good on that one.
Right.
Okay. We've talked about this before too with circumcision. These seem to be the groups that practiced circumcision in the Roman period. One of the metaphors that Paul uses is the construction of a temple. Again, we don't have a lot of time for this, but the foundation that someone lays and then the construction that happens. So people would automatically have known all about these. And these are people in the Roman world. These are not people in Jerusalem.
Right.
So this would be the kind of temple we were thinking about. Okay, so some more concerns, artifacts, architecture. We are going to go through parts of Ephesus as we think about this particular one. Okay, breastplate, all of the military hardware. We've shown some of those on the table, and so we will scoot past this. Okay, the library. Kent, you're looking for libraries everywhere you go, even our site in Jordan. This is an important contribution, isn't it?
It is, and it's a beautiful example. of a library, housing probably about 12,000 manuscripts. Inside the main room, there were niches all around the edges where you could file the scrolls and they would be categorized. We don't know particularly the categorization they use here, but in libraries that we have found, like at Herculaneum, we know that usually by author and perhaps by the philosophers. There was a great Epicurean library there. But this is a great example of architecture in the late 1st, early 2nd century.
Right. If we look at another place, it would be nice if we saw here the temple of Artemis or Diana. But what has happened? What do we have left? A pillar,
robbed.
and it's gone, isn't it? It's
One of the
destroyed
7 wonders of the ancient world.
If you go to Istanbul now, you can see some of those pillars reused in another structure.
Borrowed. Well, maybe not borrowed, taken. And kept that way.
But it stood 600 years.
Yeah, right.
And so baths, we have those. We have public toilets. These are actually exposed in a lot of different cities, Roman cities. And cheek by jowl, not a lot of privacy, but that's
I understand
what we
that
have.
you would send your servant to warm up the place, and when it was warm, then you could sit on it.
I guess if I had a servant, if you were thinking you of pointing me, which is interesting too, and we haven't talked much about it, that slavery is just assumed. We are abhorred by slavery, but it's assumed in the biblical
The Roman world, yeah.
So we need to keep that in mind. Brothels, they seem to be quite popular as well, including in the image on the right, a footprint leading with another footprint, with another footprint.
There's a
toward
heart there, follow your heart.
And there's a heart, and there is, if one looks carefully, the image of a woman on the lower part, just to the right. So another picture here of places of what we call ill repute, ill fame, something like that.
Just like slavery, it's taken for granted.
It certainly is
Yeah.
in this world. And then you talked a bit ago about the theater and its significance. And I think from this picture, we'd have to imagine that at the end of this walkway is the bay.
Harbor.
Bay
That's
is
right.
the harbor. That we would have.
And this is the theater where Paul was the prime cause of the commotion and trouble.
Correct. Huge theater, as
Right.
we've talked about. And then a few houses. I mean, these have to be really elite houses with these fine fresco walls. And if you
Mosaic
look
floors.
at some of the, that's right, mosaic floors and the images along the walls. I don't know when this comes from, but it's from Ephesus, it's a fresco, and it's Paul. So probably within a century or two of Paul's life that we would have that. And then let's see if I can get this to move. I'm not. Okay, and then a couple of inscriptions. And we will end on this one as soon as I get to it. Okay, it's not going to move. We've talked about, well, Paul talks about this dividing wall of hostility between Jews and Gentiles. We have how many inscriptions in Jerusalem?
At least a couple.
At least a couple that actually mark out that wall. And what do they say? What do these inscriptions say to Gentiles?
No Gentiles allowed.
No,
beyond this.
you will be responsible for your
Right,
death
right.
if you don't. Thank you, Larry, Warren, and Kent, and all of you for joining us for this episode of Excavating the Bible. We look forward to next time. Until then, think ancient, keep believing, and keep exploring. For Excavating the Bible, I'm Doug Clark.